Hello, it's just David here with my weekly message. Um, I'm recording one or two of these a bit ahead of time because they're sort of Easter, just post Easter, and I'm hoping to have a bit of sort of leave during that time. So I'm going to talk for each week, for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. It seems appropriate about some of the resurrection appearances, and I hope there's no sort of tumultuous event happens that I should be commenting on. But that's what I'm planning to do. And it reminds, of course, that Easter tide is a tide. It's not isn't Easter isn't a day; it's a tide. And of course, that's because the big biblical story gives us these 40 days between Easter and Ascension, with various appearances and the gospel readings at various times. Various services go through them. So I'm just going to be looking at two or three of them in these messages. I think it's interesting that in terms of seasons, that Christians are quite good at doing the penitential. We know when Advent is, we know when Lent is, particularly, and we're kind of quite good at keeping that season. When it comes to the festal seasons, eat, drink, and be merry, we tend to kind of do about a day of it, and then we're exhausted, which is quite interesting. We don't keep Christmas time. We don't, keep partying from Christmas to Epiphany or to Candlemas. And Easter, we don't keep the 40 days, that sense of celebration going up as perhaps as much as we should. But today I want to talk about the road to Emmaus. So I'm going to read a couple of verses from it. This is the crucial verses that I want to think about. But many of you know the story that Jesus is risen. He walks along the road with two or three of his disciples. They don't recognize him. He explains the scriptures to them. He asks what they're talking about. But then they arrive at Emmaus. They say, well, you can't go any further. There's nowhere to go. Why don't you stay with us tonight? And then he shares a meal with them. And this is that passage. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? Now, the obvious thing about that passage is why don't they recognize Jesus? They're not of the 12, we're told. So they wouldn't have been at the Last Supper, but they're still disciples of Jesus who know him quite well. And obviously Luke is making a dramatic point that he's recognized in the breaking of the bread, in the same way, we might say that we recognize or come to know Jesus in the Eucharist. And there are various obvious explanations. It was a dusty road, people wrapped up for the journey. Also, I think it's sometimes overlooked. As Christians, we know Jesus is risen. Of course, they weren't expecting it. This is the thing. If you see somebody in a crowd who looks like a friend or relation who's just died, or even, you meet somebody that you don't immediately think, oh, it's them. They must be risen from the dead. You think, oh, I'm mistaken. That's perhaps my grief speaking. So, they thought he was dead. There's no debate about that. He was dead. They'd just been to the funeral, effectively, the burial. It was over. The last person they're expecting to see was Jesus. We need to kind of remember that and put that into perspective. Luke actually tells us that they don't recognize Jesus because God kind of stopped them. And that's what that's the reason he gives. So I want to just think about that theme then of recognition and about how we recognize people. I'm going to start talking about something slightly different, and that is artificial intelligence. So you'll be very pleased to know that in cycling at the moment, because of COVID, when they have the podium at the end and they give out the medals, what they do is they have only the three people who've come first, second and third in the race, and obviously they keep them apart. And then they have a little robot that goes along, and the little robot, which presumably had been sanitized, kind of hands them each a medal. And it's incredibly sort of slow and laborious, and it's quite funny to watch. But it is sort of, you wouldn't want to have it all the time. And quite often they go, oh, come on, come on, come on. And it makes me wonder, and I am quite interested in this. So I have done some kind of thinking about this about artificial intelligence, because I do think, frankly, it's overhyped. One of the things I tried to do, and I know you can do it when it's kind of self-service place like McDonald's, but one of the things I tried to do is get a a robot to be a waiter at a restaurant. And frankly, it's nearly impossible. It's why it doesn't happen. We pay waiting staff in restaurants because um, it is nearly impossible at the moment to kind of get a robot to interact um, in that same way. Just that the nuances of the conversation. If you just say, I want a cheeseburger and fries, it's fine. But as soon as you say, what do you recommend? Or, what are the specials today? And, do you have vegetarian options? Immediately you kind of have the sort of script that you might have in a restaurant. Um, it just becomes the technology becomes insuperable. Now, for technical reasons, I think that's because slightly AI is barking up the wrong tree, but I won't go down that. But one of the interesting questions is, how do you get AI to recognize people? And there's various ways to do it. There's face recognition. Actually, more interesting is that there are other ways of recognizing people. Things like the way they walk, their gait, actually may be more of a kind of personal imprint, may be easier to recognize than even a face. And I think that is actually quite interesting. I quite often notice, particularly in a distance, obviously, how we recognize people often by the way they move or the way they are, not simply just because we've seen their face. It's an interesting thing about recognition. But the word recognize, of course, for us has sort of two slightly different meanings. It can mean, I recognized, suddenly there was a face in the crowd I recognized, in the sense of I didn't know who it is, now I know who it is. There's another sense, and I don't know whether the Greek verb has this meaning or not, in which recognize means, I recognize something in them. And quite often with hindsight, I didn't recognize that David was the greatest cyclist of his generation, until I saw his results. I mean, you still then wouldn't recognize. But that sense is not that, you don't know who I am. It's just that you recognize something about me, that something clicks and is put together. And I think that's kind of, in a sense, also what's happening here, in that whether you recognize the person or not, it's another thing about suddenly clicking into place, things about them. I suddenly realized maybe a fact about them or something about their personality. I recognized in them, the kind, loving person that I always wanted, that I always hoped that they would be, or whatever. And it's quite an interesting thing at that moment. Now, I was originally a mathematician, not a very good one, but I was. And but one of the interesting things about mathematical proofs, but you can start with a simple sum. 3 and 4 equals 7. Doesn't it? Yeah, 3 and 4 equals 7. I mean, it's a difficult thing, isn't it? That you can get that with children. That you kind of, there's a stage at which you can't see it because and then you do see it, and then kind of it stops being a matter of opinion. Suddenly something clicks and you see it, and once you 3 plus 4 equals 7, you never go back on it. You don't sort of say, well, as you might do on other things, well, reflecting with age, I kind of think, I was carried away. I think probably it's 9. And somebody else down the road will say, well, no, I'm really always thought that 3 plus 4 equals 13. I mean, it just doesn't make sense mathematically. Um, and the same goes up for all the levels of proof that you go up. And once you see a proof in mathematics, even quite sort of technical proofs, you kind of see it, and then there's no debate about it. But often, and as it gets harder and harder, it's more difficult. Some people just, they can't see it at all. They don't understand what all those squiggles and things mean. And I wonder whether it's sometimes like that with human beings, whether it's sometimes like that with Jesus, that we kind of, something clicks and the whole story fits together. It's not just about recognizing a face, but you suddenly think, oh, yeah, Messiah, Son of God, miracles, resurrect. It all fits together, and you get that, oh, now I see who Jesus is. Now I see what that means to my life. I mean, some people would describe that moment as conversion, and some people can say that's a particular time, or some people will say it happens more gradually for them. But that sense of recognizing actually who Jesus is and knowing it in our hearts is something, as I say, I think that we as Christians might think about. I say it may come in an instant, it may take slightly longer, but whatever it is, I just wonder, what do we recognize in Jesus? What do we see in him? How does he call to us? Thank you.